January 22nd, 1879. The shadow of a Sandalwana mountain falls across a British camp where 1,800 soldiers clean rifles and count ammunition. The morning air carries the scent of wood smoke and leather, but no sound of approaching feet across 20,000 strong. But this red line will not hold. This is the story of how a Zulu kingdom armed with shields and spears shattered the myth that modern firepower could never be overwhelmed by traditional tactics. To understand how an empire's greatest humiliation began, we must first understand the enemy they thought they knew. King Cetshwayo commanded not a rabble of primitive warriors, but a disciplined military machine that had been perfecting the art of encirclement for 50 years. His regiments moved like the horns of a great beast, designed to embrace and crush any force that dared enter Zululand. The British had crossed the Buffalo River 3 days earlier, confident that breech-loading rifles and 7-pound artillery pieces would clear any path their empire demanded. The invasion of Zululand was meant to be a demonstration, not a war. Lord Chelmsford led 15,000 troops across 3 columns into a kingdom that refused to dissolve itself for British convenience. The plan was simple: march to Ulundi, capture the king, and add another red patch to the map of Africa. But plans assume the enemy will cooperate. The British carried Martini Henry rifles that could kill at 1,000 yards, mountain guns that fired explosive shells, and the absolute certainty that disciplined firepower would scatter any native force foolish enough to stand in formation. They had read the reports from the American frontier where repeating rifles had broken tribal resistance. They had studied the lessons of colonial warfare across 3 continents. What they had not studied was the Zulu military system that King Shaka had forged 60 years earlier. The Amazulu were not raiders or hunters pressed into service. They were professional soldiers who lived in military barracks, trained in coordinated maneuvers, and fought in regiments that had earned their battle honors across decades of warfare. The legend speaks of 20,000 Zulus at Isandlwana. Modern historians place the number closer to 12,000, but numbers alone do not explain what happened on that morning beneath the mountain. The Zulu army was not a mob with spears. It was a tactical instrument designed for one purpose: to close with the enemy and destroy them in personal combat. Each Zulu warrior carried an assegai thrusting spear, a knob carry club, and a cowhide shield that could deflect a bullet if angled correctly. More importantly, each warrior knew his place in a formation that could bend like a serpent and strike like a claw. The British knew none of this as they made camp in the shadow of a Sandalwana mountain, confident that modern warfare had made such knowledge unnecessary. The British chose their campsite for convenience, not defense. The Sandalwana mountain provided a distinctive landmark and shelter from the wind, but it also blocked the view northeast toward the Nyoni Ridge. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pauline commanded the camp while Lord Chelmsford took half the force on a reconnaissance toward the Mangini Gorge. This division of force violated every principle of frontier warfare, but Chelmsford was hunting what he believed were scattered Zulu bands. Intelligence reports spoke of cattle raids and small war parties, not a main army moving in disciplined formation through the broken country beyond the ridge. The camp itself sprawled across open ground without earthworks or wagon loggers. British doctrine assumed that modern rifles created their own defensive perimeter. Why dig when Martini Henry rifles could deliver aimed fire at 800 yards and maintain rapid fire at close range? The mathematics seemed simple. Disciplined volleys would shatter any charge long before spears could reach British lines. But mathematics depend on seeing the enemy approach. On the morning of January 22nd, mounted patrols reported Zulu movement to the northeast. Small parties, they said. Nothing that suggested a major threat. The camp routine continued: breakfast, equipment maintenance, ammunition distribution to company quartermasters. What the patrols could not see from the valley floor was the main Zulu army, 20 regiments strong, moving in perfect silence through the dongas and ravines beyond Nyoni Ridge. They had been marching for 2 days, sleeping in tactical formation, eating cold food to avoid the smoke of cooking fires. If the British had sent scouts to the high ground, would they have spotted the encircling horns before they closed? The question would haunt the survivors, but on that bright summer morning, confidence felt like preparation enough. The Zulu army moved like a living thing across the landscape, but its movement followed a pattern older than memory. The Impondo Zankamo, the horns of the beast, was not merely a formation, but a philosophy of warfare. The chest would pin the enemy in place while the horns swept wide to embrace and destroy. Chief Nchingwayo commanded the center, the veteran regiments whose job was to absorb punishment and hold fast until the encirclement closed. The right horn, led by Chief Zibhepu, would arc south toward the Nyoni escarpment. The left horn, under Chief Mavumengwana, would swing north to cut the road back to Rourke's Drift. But first, they had to cross 15 miles of broken country without being detected. The march began before dawn on January 21st. 12,000 warriors moved in regimental columns, through dongas that carved the high veld like the lines in an old man's palm. Each regiment knew its place, its timing, its role in the great envelopment. They carried no heavy equipment, no artillery, no supply wagons that might slow their advance or betray their position with dust, clouds. The Yukon Dempemvu Regiment, the young men eager for their first taste of battle, formed the chest. The Umbonambi and Unokenka, veterans of campaigns against the Pedi and Swazi, held the left horn. The Umhlanga and Umsiko regiments, men who had fought beside King Sitchwayo since his rise to power, anchored the right. This was not a desperate charge by untrained warriors. This was a tactical machine executing a plan that had been rehearsed in countless mock battles and refined through generations of warfare. The Zulu commanders understood terrain, timing, and the psychology of their enemy better than the British understood themselves. By nightfall on January 21st, the horns were in position. The beast had drawn breath and was ready to strike. The British camp, visible in the distance like a scattering of white tents against the red earth, showed no sign of alarm. The first shots rang out at 11:30 in the morning. Lieutenant Charlie Raw's mounted volunteers had ridden beyond Nyoni Ridge in pursuit of what they thought was a cattle raiding party. Instead, they found themselves staring down into a valley where thousands of Zulu warriors sat in perfect silence, waiting for the signal to attack. The discovery was accidental, the response was not. Within minutes, the entire Zulu army was in motion. The chest rose from the grass like a black tide, shields locked, assegais gleaming in the summer sun. The horns began their sweep, moving with the fluid precision of a closing trap. What had been invisible became unstoppable. Back at the camp, Lieutenant Colonel Pauline received fragmentary reports. Zulu movement to the northeast. Large numbers, but how large? The mounted patrols were falling back, firing as they retreated, but their estimates varied wildly. 500 warriors, 2,000, more than could be counted. Pauline made his first fatal error. Instead of concentrating his force in a defensive square around the camp, he deployed his companies in an extended line facing northeast. The logic seemed sound. Use the range advantage of the Martini-Henry rifles to break up the Zulu attack before it could develop momentum. But extended lines require perfect coordination and unlimited ammunition resupply. More critically, they assume the enemy will attack where you expect them to attack. The 24th Foot formed the center of the British line. 6 companies deployed at intervals that allowed for overlapping fields of fire. The native contingent extended the flanks, native troops armed with obsolete muskets and led by white officers who spoke no Zulu. Artillery crews unlimbered their 7-pounders and loaded with case shot, each round designed to scatter dozens of iron balls across advancing formations. The British line stretched nearly a mile from end to end. It looked impressive from the camp, red coats and glinting bayonets arranged with parade ground precision. But it was a line designed to fight a European enemy in open country, not a tactical system built to embrace and crush its opponents. The Zulu chest was 3 miles away and closing fast. The horns were invisible, moving through dead ground toward positions that would render the extended line meaningless. The British line opened fire at 600 yards. Volleys crashed across the valley in perfect sequence, white smoke rolling from the Martini-Henry rifles like morning mist. The mathematics of modern warfare seemed to be working. Zulu warriors stumbled and fell as the heavy .450 grain bullets found their mark. But the chest kept coming. What looked like a frontal assault was actually a fixing attack, designed to hold British attention while the real killing stroke developed on the flanks. The Ukondempemvu Regiment absorbed the punishment and pressed forward, shields raised, bodies low, using every fold in the ground to minimize exposure to rifle fire. Then the British line began to stretch. Reports arrived from the northern flank. Zulu warriors moving in strength toward the camp. Captain George Young Husband took 2 companies of the 24th Foot to extend the line northward. More reports from the south, another threat developing. Captain William Dagisher moved with additional companies to cover the southern approaches. The mile-long line became a mile and a half, then 2 miles. Companies that had been mutually supporting now fought in isolation, connected only by mounted messengers who carried increasingly desperate requests for ammunition and reinforcements. The Zulu plan was working exactly as designed. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the horns struck simultaneously. Chief Zibhebu's warriors swept around the southern end of the British line, like water flowing around a stone. Chief Mavumengwana's regiments emerged from the broken ground north of the camp, cutting the road to Rorke's Drift and trapping the British between the mountain and the approaching chest. The extended line that had looked so formidable an hour earlier was now surrounded on 3 sides. Companies turned to face multiple directions, breaking the coordinated fire that was their only advantage against superior numbers. Individual soldiers found themselves fighting alone, reloading frantically as Zulu warriors closed the final yards between rifle and assegai. The crescent had closed. The trap was complete. What remained was not a battle but a reckoning, measured in minutes rather than hours, decided by courage and desperation rather than tactics and technology. The killing began when the ammunition ran out. British soldiers had been firing continuously for over an hour, burning through their personal supply of 70 rounds per man. Company quartermaster sergeants ran between the firing line and the ammunition wagons, but the wagons were positioned behind the camp, 300 yards from the extended line that now faced enemies on 3 sides. Worse, the ammunition boxes were sealed with copper bands and iron screws that required tools to open. What had seemed like sensible protection against moisture and rough handling became a death sentence when seconds mattered more than safety protocols. Private Williams of the 1st Battalion ran back toward the wagons, his ammunition pouches empty, Zulu warriors closing within 100 yards of his position. He found chaos instead of resupply. Quartermasters struggled with stubborn box lids while desperate soldiers pleaded for cartridges. Some boxes contained the wrong caliber rounds. Others held ammunition for artillery pieces that had already been overrun. The breakdown of supply created pockets of silence along the British line. Soldiers who had been firing disciplined volleys now clutched empty rifles and fixed bayonets for hand-to-hand combat. They had never been trained to win. Communication collapsed with the ammunition system. Lieutenant Tynemouth Melville tried to reach the northern companies with orders to fall back and consolidate, but the mounted messengers found only scattered groups of men fighting for their lives. The extended line that had stretched to meet every threat now broke into isolated fragments, each facing overwhelming numbers without support. Individual acts of courage blazed briefly in the gathering disaster. Color Sergeant Wolfe of the 2nd Battalion held his position until the last cartridge was fired, then drew his sword and charged alone into a crowd of Zulu warriors. Lieutenant Edgar Anstey organized the surviving gunners into a final stand around the last artillery piece, firing case shot at point-blank range until the Zulu rush overwhelmed the guns. But courage without ammunition was a currency that bought only time, and time had run out beneath Isandlwana Mountain. The red line was breaking, not from cowardice or poor training, but from the simple mathematics of empty rifles facing full spears. The colors of the 24th Foot flew above a shrinking circle of red coats at the base of Isandlwana Mountain. Lieutenant Tangmouth Melville and Lieutenant Neville Coghill had torn the regimental standards from their poles, wrapping the silk around their bodies as Zulu warriors closed in from all sides. This was no longer about conquest or territory. This was about getting home alive. Small groups of survivors fought back to back, bayonets against assegais, desperate men who knew that surrender meant death, but fought anyway because fighting was all they had left. The native contingent, abandoned by their white officers, threw down their obsolete muskets and ran for the Buffalo River. Some would make it, most would not. Lieutenant Charlie Pope gathered the remaining men of G Company around a wagon full of medical supplies, using the vehicle as a fortress while ammunition lasted, and a tomb when it did not. They held for 20 minutes against overwhelming odds, buying time for other survivors to attempt escape toward Rorke's Drift. But the mountain offered no sanctuary. Zulu warriors moved like hunting cats through the broken ground, cutting off escape routes and surrounding isolated groups. The Impi had trained for this moment, the final phase when victory became massacre and enemies became trophies. Melville and Coghill broke free from the main fighting, spurring their horses toward the Buffalo River crossing 12 miles away. The colors bounced against their backs as they rode, the last symbols of British authority in a land that was rejecting their presence with spears and shields. Behind them, the camp burned. Tents collapsed into orange flames that sent black smoke climbing toward the African sky. Supply wagons exploded as fire reached ammunition stores that had been too far from the fighting line to save British lives, but close enough to feed Zulu victory fires. The killing lasted 3 hours from first contact to final silence. When it ended, the redcoats lay scattered across 2 miles of veldt like autumn leaves after a storm. They had not died from cowardice or incompetence. They had died because they brought the wrong war to the wrong enemy in the wrong place. The battlefield fell quiet except for the sound of wind through grass and the distant cry of vultures circling overhead. Of the 1,800 British and colonial troops who had awakened that morning in the shadow of Isandlwana Mountain, fewer than 60 would see another dawn. The mathematics of disaster were written in the red earth. Lieutenant Colonel Pauline lay dead beside his tent, sword still in his hand. Captain George Younghusband fell with his company, surrounded by empty cartridge cases that told the story of their final minutes. The colors of the 24th Foot rested at the bottom of the Buffalo River, carried there by Melville and Coghill, who died within sight of safety. But victory had come with a price that Zulu mothers would mourn for generations. The chest regiments that had absorbed British rifle fire for 3 hours paid in blood for their courage. The Ukondempemvu lost nearly half their strength, young warriors who would never return to the royal kraal to receive their war honors. Chief Nchingwayo himself carried wounds that would mark him for life, scars earned leading from the front in the tradition of Zulu commanders. Modern estimates place Zulu casualties at over 2,000 killed and wounded, losses that represented nearly 20% of the attacking force. The spears had won, but the rifles had taken their toll before falling silent. The survivors moved through the camp methodically, following the ancient customs of war that demanded respect for brave enemies. British dead were left intact, their wounds treated with the dignity owed to warriors who had fought to the last cartridge. The Zulu army understood courage when they saw it, even beneath red coats and foreign flags. Smoke from the burning wagons drifted across the field as the sun set behind Isandlwana Mountain. The great beast had been fed, but it limped as it withdrew toward the royal kraal, carrying news of a victory that had cost more than anyone had imagined when the war began. The telegraph wires carried impossible news to London. An entire British column had been destroyed by native warriors armed with spears and cowhide shields. The War Office clerks read the dispatches twice, certain that some critical detail had been garbled in transmission. But the details were correct, and they shattered assumptions that had guided imperial policy for 50 years. Queen Victoria received the news at Windsor Castle on February 11th, 17 days after the battle. The delay had allowed wild rumors to spread through London drawing rooms and Manchester textile mills. Some claimed that Lord Chelmsford himself was dead. Others whispered that the entire invasion force had been wiped out, leaving Natal defenseless against Zulu revenge. The reality was bad enough. A modern European army equipped with the finest weapons of the industrial age had been outfought and destroyed by African warriors using tactics that predated gunpowder. The myth of technological supremacy, the bedrock belief that had justified colonial expansion across 3 continents, lay buried beneath Isandlwana Mountain. Parliament demanded answers. How had 1,800 troops with modern rifles been overwhelmed by spear-carrying natives? Opposition members rose in the House of Commons to question not just the tactics at Isandlwana, but the entire philosophy of imperial warfare that assumed firepower could substitute for tactical wisdom. The military establishment struggled to explain away the inexplicable. Official reports blamed ammunition shortages, inadequate reconnaissance, and the division of forces. All true, but none sufficient to explain how a professional European army had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered by an enemy they had dismissed as primitive. This was not merely a military defeat. This was proof that the empire could be humiliated by opponents who understood war better than the generals who had conquered India and pacified the northwest frontier. The Zulu kingdom had done what no European power had managed in a century of conflict. It had destroyed a British army in open battle and made that destruction look inevitable. Today, white cairns mark the spots where British soldiers fell beneath Isandlwana mountain. Visitors walk among the stones in silence, reading names carved into granite monuments that speak of courage without victory. The mountain itself remains unchanged, its distinctive profile still casting shadows across ground where empires learned the limits of their power. The Zulu people remember differently. Oral traditions preserve the names of warriors who charged into rifle fire because their king commanded it and their ancestors demanded it. The praise songs celebrate tactical brilliance over technological advantage, wisdom over weapons, courage over comfort, but the deeper lesson of Isandlwana lives beyond monuments and praise songs. This battle proved that superior equipment could not substitute for superior understanding. The British brought better rifles, better artillery, better uniforms and supply systems. The Zulus brought better tactics, better intelligence, better adaptation to the terrain where the fighting would be decided. The defeat taught the British Empire a humility it had forgotten in decades of easy victories over disorganized opponents. Future colonial campaigns would respect local military traditions instead of dismissing them. The myth of inevitable technological triumph died in the grass beneath Isandlwana mountain, replaced by a harder wisdom about the relationship between tools and the hands that wield them. King Cetshwayo won his greatest victory on January 22, 1879, but he could not win the war that followed. British reinforcements arrived with lesson plans written in blood and defeat. The Zulu kingdom fell 6 months later, its tactical brilliance overwhelmed by imperial determination and unlimited resources. The mountain remembers all of it: the courage, the folly, the price of underestimating enemies who fight for their homeland with weapons they understand better than their opponents understand theirs. Some lessons require graves to teach them properly.